So neoliberalism as a hegemonic idea. Um, so Harvey continues to look at why neoliberalism become a hegemonic idea globally. So he was saying that U.S. interventions might explain neoliberal turn in some Latin American cases such as Chile, because U.S. essentially supports some of the military coup in Latin American countries in order to take down the leftist leaders and put up some leaders who will support U.S. policies, especially neoliberal policies. Um, but this cannot really explain its uneven spreads to the UK, China, and India because there were no direct US interventions in this country. So now I'm going back to the development theories over time. Remembering in the 1970s, we were talking about dependency theory and growth with equity, where there's this whole decades on environmental protection and social equity has given rise to new ideas like basic needs approach and also participatory approaches. And then 1970s is a really interesting decade where there are a lot of grassroots movements because there's a rising unemployment and inflations after the 50s and 60s. So people are getting more and more unsatisfied about global capitalism. And then there's a worldwide call for equity and socialist reforms, the limits to growth. So this really presented a threat to the ruling class everywhere and the rich people everywhere. So Harvey posed a question: is neoliberalism a theoretical template for the reorganization of international capitalism, or actually a political scheme aimed at establishing the conditions for capital accumulation and the restoration of class power? So he argued that it is the latter, right? It is a political project by the ruling elites or the rich people to restore their class power. So he demonstrated this by showing the results of neoliberalism. So the top 0.1% in the US increased the share of the national income from 2% to more than 6% from 1978 to 1999. And these figures continues to grow. Right? And then the ratio of the median compensations of workers to the salaries of chief executive officers increased from 30 to 1 to 400 to 1 from 1970 to 2000. So the gap between a normal workers and the CEO becomes bigger and bigger. And how about globally? So this is a figure I draw from World Inequality Reports of 2016 to show how the world is faring in terms of income inequalities. So this is share of national income by the top 10%. The purple color, which is Russia, witnessed exponential growth of the wealth of the top 10%, mainly because Russia was a socialist country before 1990, and so socialist is being known for state control of property, so people are pretty much having the equal number of wealth. Also India also experienced quite a remarkable growth, even though that has kind of plateaued in 2010. And then, so basically, all countries have rising inequalities to different extents. Only green color, which is Europe. So Europe has a lot of sort of social democratic state with high tax policies and big social safety nets. So they are doing relatively well in terms of addressing inequalities, even though the number still rises a little bit from 1980s to 2015. And then this is showing the same data in a different way, looking at different regions and some of the big economies in the world. So the top 10% national income share across the world. So in Europe, the top 10% have 37% of the national income as of 2017. And then the highest is actually Middle East, with the top 10% having a 61% of the national income. And then we have India, Brazil, and Sub-Saharan Africa have similar inequality rates. And US Canada is actually doing a little bit better than Sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, and India. And inequality in the US is really startling. So you can see the top 1% is having really quite persistently rising share of national incomes, and the bottom 50% is having low and lower share of national income. So Harvey also talks about how neoliberalism spreads, right? So we talk about how in some of the Latin America countries it is true military coup with US-backed support, such as in Chile, Argentina, and Iraq. So in a way, these neoliberal policies are being imposed through political interventions. But also, Harvey argues that there are a lot of U.S. universities and think tanks that train economists worldwide to push for the idea of neoliberalism. So I personally, when I scan for scholarship, what can fund my own PhD study, I really come across a lot of institutions and scholarship that target the ideology of free market. Like they say that as long as your research is promoting free market, you can get our scholarship. So one of them is like Adam Smith scholarship. And then we have the IMF, which we have already talked about, through the structural adjustment programs, have imposed neoliberal policies on poor countries. And then also there's a thing called the Washington Consensus, the agreement between IMF, World Bank, and the U.S. Department of Treasury on policy recommendations to developing countries, and are very much based on neoliberal ideas. After 1995, when the World Trade Organization was established, many of the rules negotiated under WTO is actually trying to promote neoliberalism, and many countries sign on to it, as we have said before. And these rules have real sanctions. Like if you don't follow this rule, you can be potentially sued by companies for not following these rules. There's a lot of covert aid to support pro-US country leaders. The US mobilized the G7, which are the world's top capitalist powers, to collaborate and push for neoliberal agenda. And also 1990 is the end of Cold War, so that's why Margaret Thatcher said there is no alternative. It is proven that communism and socialism doesn't work, capitalism works, free trade works. Harvey went on to discuss how does neoliberalism contributes to the consolidations of class power. But the first one is the commodification and privatizations of land. Right, how lands which is previously not owned by anyone or owned communally, or a public land, becomes a commodity and become private properties, and also the natural resources that come with it, right? Number 4. And then number 2 is the conversion of various forms of properties rights into exclusively private properties rights, including intellectual properties. So you can see that there was a controversy of how indigenous medicinal plants components were being developed by pharmaceutical companies into drugs, and they then have intellectual properties protecting themselves so that other people cannot use the same formula to produce drugs. So all these things become a source of commodity. And then commodification of labor power and appropriation of natural resources, and then usury, the national debt, and the use of the credit system to earn more profits. So, and land and labor power actually has been discussed by Marx before, when he discussed how capitalism is a system of exploitation. He talks about how the peasants are actively displaced from their land or from their production system, so that they so that the land can be used for profit, and then the labor or the displaced peasants can become proletariat, labor power, to work in the factories to serve the capital. And then there's this neoliberal additions of debt, credit system, and intellectual property by Harvey. And then I also have given you a reading on crack economy in New York by the Puerto Rican communities. I mainly want to show you through this article how does neoliberalism look like on the ground. So, and if you remember our last article about urban poverty, which is on Argentina's shantytown, you can see there are actually a lot of similarities of arguments between the two articles. So, for example, the Argentinian article talk about how there is a change from manufacturing economy to service economy, and that has caused high unemployment and flexploitation. And then for the Puerto Rican community in New York, so Bourgeois argue that, I'm not sure that's how the name is pronounced, but I will try to say Bourgeois for now. He argued that people have actually gone through at least 6 different kinds of modes of productions throughout 3 to 4 generations. So previously, when they were in Puerto Rico, they are small land-owning semi-subsistent peasants, and then they became export agricultural laborers on foreign-owned capital-intensive plantations, and then they become urban migrants in maybe Puerto Rico or in United States, other parts of United States, as factory workers in urban shanty towns, and then become sweatshop workers in ghetto tenements. And then they transition into service sector employees in high-rise inner-city housing projects, and then underground economy entrepreneurs and homeless on the street. The author claimed that he's exploring the common sense of street culture in New York, and he focused on some 25 street-level crack dealers. He actually lived in the area and befriended these people and talked to them along with his family, actually his son and his wife. And he reviewed how manufacturing industry changing into service industry is culturally disruptive to people. And this is not reviewed by any statistics on the reduction of income or increased inequalities, right? So he gave example of the life of Julio. So Julio, when he was young, he was working in the manufacturing industry. He dropped out of school because he found out that he can actually earn more money and be a more responsible young person by working and earning money to help the family. So during his time in the manufacturing industry, he adopted a culture suitable for shop floor, meaning he has to be like tough and protective of himself, standing up against his manager. Then once this manufacturing industry transitions in the service industry, Julio faced big difficulties because his attitude or the way he behaves, the way he talks, it's really deemed to be not very suitable to be in the service sector. So he constantly felt humiliated. So for example, he always say that his boss is saying that he's stupid all the time and try to micromanage him. So after trying several jobs and desperately losing some of them, he really felt humiliated. So he turned to crack underground economy, selling drugs, where he can be tough again using violence and be powerful rather than powerless, right? This explains both the structural factor and psychosocial factor of why crack dealers become crack dealers potentially, right? So this offers a complementary view compared to our article on Argentina's shanty towns, because Auro didn't seem to have talked to specifically crack dealers, but he talked to people whose lives have been affected by the violence of crack dealers. And the authors also talk about Julio's mom's life. So Julio's mom seems to be very nostalgic about the past in Puerto Rico, where they used to grow their own food and where there's family and community caring about each other, and then they're able to maintain traditions. Life back then was much happier, right? So this life, the life story of these two people really reflect back to how there's a changing economy under neoliberalizations. So under neoliberalizations, there is a flexible accumulation of capital, meaning investments and capital can actually relocate from one sector to another sector very easily, relocate from one border to another border very easily. So maybe today it is cheaper for me to make my garments in Mexico, so I invest there, and once it becomes not that profitable anymore, I can easily relocate them to other places, maybe in Bangladesh. So because of neoliberal policy, it is very easy for capital to do that, to come in and out of the country, and a lot of this capital becomes a short-term, high-profit oriented kind of capital. And then this flexible accumulation also leads to flexploitation. So because of the race to the bottom, like countries try to attract foreign investment and foreign capital, they have weaker and weaker regulations to protect their labor and environment. Capital are able to take opportunities of neoliberal policies to hire temporary workers and to fire workers as they wish, to use contractor rather than having a permanent employment or having to pay for the benefits of social security of the employees. And then this article also talks a lot about psychosocial and cultural aspects related to drugs and violence, right, as I have already mentioned. So you can see that again and again we are talking about both structural factor and also cultural factors in poverty. And this is of course entangled with social positions, like if you are Puerto Rican male compared to a white male, Puerto Rican female compared to a Puerto Rican male, a Mexican male compared to a Puerto Rican male. So all this makes a difference within the structure.